Hello, this is Judy Maddox. I'm chair of our Western North Carolina Sierra Club. And tonight we are very, very honored to present Lisa Raleigh and Renee with the River Link and talking about the French Broad River after Helene. As you guys know, we are partners with Ollie at UNCA, but as you also know, with Helene, UNCA is closed except to virtual programs with the students. So we will return in January, we believe, with our hybrid programs, but we are honored to be a partner with Ollie. Sierra Club, as you may know, is a three-level organization. National Sierra Club puts out a magazine every month. We'd love to have you join that. Our state chapter, Sierra Club in Raleigh, is its own entity with which we are a member, and they work on things like wood chips, and Europe believing that our forest in the southeast is a renewable source of energy for them, and they certainly have been taken advantage of and chopped up into chips and shipped off to England and other countries. And we are working with governors and the state chapter to try to help with those issues, as well as other issues, rivers. But what we're interested for you guys is to join our Western North Carolina Sierra Club. And if you are not a current member, please go to our website, which is WNC Sierra Club. Simple as that, just WNCSierraClub.org. At the bottom of the homepage, it will say, would you like to get our e-newsletters? And we would love to send them to you. Now, you can unsubscribe anytime you want, but we tell you what these programs are, and we tell you what our action alerts are, how we would like you to help with lobbying efforts or cleanup efforts or whatever, endorsements. We would like to acknowledge with respect that we are on the ancestral land of the Cherokee. We thank them respectfully for protecting our forests and our environment for so many generations. As you know, every first Wednesday of the month for many years now, we have done our programs, and it will be in January, both hybrid, again, in person at the Ollie Center at UNCA Reuters Center, but right now it is on Zoom link, and we are honored to have you guys join on Zoom. For December, it will be the second Wednesday, after all, December 11th, because that's when we could get our old home base Unitarian Universalist congregation, 1 Edmund Place. It is a potluck gathering. Please bring a dish. We would encourage you to be vegetarian. Please bring a list of what the ingredients are, because a number of people have various allergies. Please also bring your own place settings that you will take home with you to wash, as opposed to having the washing be there at the church. And we will certainly honor one of our wonderful sustainable heroes, Brownie Newman. We would love to have you guys join, and we get to see each other in person. We will have a hike. Ed, can you unmute yourself and tell us about the upcoming hike?
I'd be happy to. Like many things during Helene, our hike program was put on hold, but we've got our first hike coming up post Helene, Thursday, November the 14th, as you can see, and we're going to Daniel Ridge Loop, a beautiful loop with lots of great cascades and a big waterfall in Pisgah National Forest, and it is one that's been cleared by the National Forest. So if you're interested, you can jump on the website that Judy mentioned and get my email and phone number. Just text me or email me, and we'll get you lined up to go. We're shooting to have a couple every month from now on.
Great, thank you, Ed. And Ed, I'm going to turn it back to you to explain what our wonderful Kids Adventure Club is.
Yeah, this is part of the national ICO program from Sierra Club, where we take youngsters out into the outdoors. And for many of them, it's a place that they're not used to. It's not part of their family history or culture, and we want them to get out and enjoy that. We're working right now with Asheville Middle School and have a club called Trailblazers that gets kids out once a week for 8 weeks in the fall and winter. So if you're interested in helping specifically with that program, or you want to find out more about it, you could get my information off the website where the hike is, or as you can see, you can contact Judy.
Thank you again, Ed. And now we want to talk a little bit about the election. I mean, we all are grieving and we all want to celebrate. My gosh, the volunteers were just exceptional. We had 187 people who staffed 432 shifts, totaling 1,200 hours. We handed out 40,000 Sierra Club environmental candidate endorsement cards. We had superstars, Doc Sulak, 15 shifts, Sharon Ladoc, 18 shifts. We had 9 people taking the 5-foot signs to all the different polling sites, which I'm sure you saw. We had 10 folks with boxes of cards on their porches with the neck placards, which again, I'm sure that you saw. We want to honor Mayo Taylor for doing our Sign Up Genius website, and me, Judy Maddox, for the administration, but we are honoring each and every one of us. And now I want to turn it over to Ken for a little bit of election analysis and a little bit of celebration. Ken?
Yes, I think there's no question we're all both in shock and really struggling with what's happened at the national level. But I want to take us a step back and let us focus on what happened in Buncombe County and what happened in North Carolina. If the national election had gone differently, we would all be celebrating and jumping for joy. Our statewide candidates, we elected a governor, our endorsed candidate for governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state, and I mentioned attorney general and state school superintendent. We elected more statewide endorsed candidates this time than any time since 2008. In addition to that, it looks like we have broken the supermajority in the North Carolina House. So Josh Stein's vetoes going forward can be sustained. And so that can prevent a lot of damage at the state level. Locally in Buncombe County, every one of our endorsed candidates that are on our endorsement card won. And I want to point out 3 of those races in particular. One is Lindsay Prather, who is running for re-election for the North Carolina House. And Lindsay, they redrew her district, gerrymandered it, so that in a normal election, a Republican would win 52% of the vote and her 48%. She not only won, but she won by 3 percentage points. So 7 points better than what would have been expected. And in addition to that, her election was a key race to be able to break the supermajority. Had she lost, we would not have been able to break the supermajority. Terry Wells, in the same gerrymandered district, is running for county commission. Her opponent outspent her 2-1, and she again won by 8 points, which was even more amazing. And then Amanda Edwards for chair of the Buncombe County Commission. Again, she was running against a well-known former sheriff who spent 3 times as much money as she did in the race, and she won with over 60% of the vote. So just amazing results locally and the best results statewide we've had again since 2008. So we really need to focus on the positives right now, because I know we're all very depressed about what's happened at the national level.
All right, thank you, Ken. And now I want to introduce Lisa, who you guys have all come to hear. So this is what Lisa would like you to know about her. She comes to Riverlink from a lifetime out west, a hydrologist by training and a passionate nonprofit leader and fundraiser by practice. Lisa is committed to carrying forth the mission of Riverlinks in partnership with the talented staff and the board on behalf of the French Broad River watershed and the communities that live alongside of her. So Lisa, we are welcome you, and I want to remind everyone we're expecting a couple of hundred people, so keep yourself mute. Stop your video, please, and put all of your questions in chat. And please know that we won't get to all of your chat questions, but put them there and we will do the best that we can. So thank you, Lisa. Appreciate, and you take it away.
Awesome. Judy, thank you for the introduction. As she shared, I'm Lisa Raleigh. I'm Riverlink's Executive Director. I've been in this position. I'm entering my 4th year. I want to begin with reverence before we get into this topic. Just so much was tragically lost during Helene, and people lost lives and homes and businesses, and the destruction to habitat. On some level, it's truly beyond comprehension. And I think it's so important to remember that as we talk about how the watershed moves forward. As Ken was speaking to, I also want to kind of ask for your grace and bear with me this evening. It's been a really intense 6 weeks since the hurricane and capped by this election. And definitely my nervous system is frayed and my soul hurts. But I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity and the Sierra Club. My colleague Renee Fortner and I presented to the Sierra Club about 1.5 years ago. And that was on the past, present, and future of the French Broad. And so now, I'm back here today on behalf of the organization to maybe try to make some sense at the 30,000-foot view of just the extreme impact and hopefully the potential opportunities in Helene's wake, and to do so from a really watershed and flooding perspective. This disaster is so widespread and has impacted at so many levels, but I hope to maybe just circle around the watershed and flooding. And I come to this humbly saying every day I have way more questions than answers. It's been such a journey to learn every day, and I love the process of learning. I feel like this is a graduate level course here. So I'm here tonight just to offer thoughts and conversation, and know that this is a really long journey to understanding and to repair. First, let me quickly just drop into Riverlink's mission. For those of you that know us, our whole purpose is to promote both the environmental and economic vitality of the French Broad River watershed, and to do that for all. Equity is a huge initiative at our organization, and ensuring that we have a really inclusive watershed. So Riverlink has a really rich history with Asheville and the River Arts District in particular. Our visionary founder, Karen Craig Nolan, founded Riverlink over 35 years ago with this really ambitious goal to champion the French Broad River as it rolled through Asheville. And at that time, the river was defined by heavy industry, dilapidation, neglect, and chronic pollution. And thanks to Karen's effort and many others over the decades, the river had been treated with so much more care. And abandoned warehouses and other structures became home to hundreds of artists and breweries and restaurants and the river businesses that just flanked all of this by parks and ribbons and greenways. And it all anchored the vitality and creativity that really defines Asheville. And unfortunately, the sequence of unrelenting rain followed by that massive inland hurricane just tested all human inventions. And so Riverlink begins its next 35-year journey. And much like Asheville has a history with the French Broad River, and the region does. The flood of 1916 really defined that. And our next chapter, Asheville's next chapter, will be defined by Hurricane Helene, which actually peaked 1.5 feet higher. So tonight, I'm hoping to touch on a bunch of different topics because this is a really complex equation. When we look at the watershed, we look at the damage and we ask ourselves, how should we go forward? There's a lot of factors built in. We've got to touch on the economy and what that means to us and how the watershed is integral to that. We have to look at the really unique geology, geography, and hydrology, which define our region and our future. We can touch on some of the extraordinary resources that are currently available and some of the previous studies that have been done. I'd love to just throw out some tangible, resilient outcome ideas to see if we can just find some ways to move forward that are doable and doable in the short term. And I think it's important to circle back on what it means to live in a water-rich area, because that is another thing. We can't just look at the storm. We have to look at our background. And then just to summarize with, I don't know, overarching takeaways from our perspective. So when Renee and I were here a year and a half ago, one of the things we talked about was the extraordinary economic value of the watershed to the region. The French Broad River Partnership completed a really large-scale survey that found out that this watershed brings over $3.8 billion in economic value to the area. And so we are built on her. And this is not only quality of life for those of us that live here, but visitors and dollars and businesses. And I would also offer that our region's identities, some of our most valuable places that are so just incredible assets, whether it be residents or tourism, they're so intertwined with flood-prone areas. So when you look at the River Arts District or Biltmore Village or East Asheville on the Swannanoa corridor, or our friends up north in Marshall and Hot Springs, or our neighbors over in Back Cave and Lake Lure, all of these collectively represent entire economies to us. We have the arts, we have outdoor recreation, we have tourism, we have retail, we have restaurant, we have lodging. But all of these are in vulnerable flood spaces. So why is that? Well, we have some of the most unique geology, geography, and hydrology perhaps in the world. So our home is one of the most biologically diverse places in the temperate world. And that's why we're all here. And that's why it's a climate refugee. Our temperatures here are so amazing. And it's this setting that yields this. And so it's an unbelievably awesome place to be able to live. And you see this diversity also in our streams and rivers. But a challenge is this very same set of conditions can also yield flooding. And if you haven't had a chance to check these guys out, the geo models on YouTube, they run a series of videos that are like 30 minutes long, and they're done by scientists and geologists, and they do them in really mainstream terms and language. But they had an episode last week called "Why Did Asheville and Swannanoa Flood So Badly During Helene?" And I actually have a degree in geology, but I was so amazed and awe-inspired by what is going on here in our region. And it gave so much more sense to why in a massive flood things happened the way they did. So I'm just going to touch on a couple elements of that because I think it's really important to understand that as we go forward. So we have this really ancient geology here. We're in these Blue Ridge Mountains that are like this massive mountain building and erosion, and a pretty extraordinary complex with a lot of complicated layers and strata. But what makes things really unusual is mountain originated rivers, like where I come from in Colorado, typically are narrowed in, steep, walled in, high energy in the mountains. But as they move downstream, they're able to hit the valley floors and they open out into their floodplains. And so they can still do flooding damage, but the energy dissipates and it goes out laterally. What makes the French Broad in particular really unique that they showcased in this segment was, so it headwaters out of, Transylvania County. It's got its forks coming in. And yeah, those are mountain origins, but then it rolls into Henderson County and gets into the Mills River area. And that geology and subsequent topography is very different. And it actually is more agricultural and open. And so as the river is gaining momentum in a flood event, it actually has the chance. The French Broad can open up and flood wide like one would in a valley. But then the geology changes again, and it has to drop into the Asheville Basin, and ultimately it's got to get out down by Marshall and Hot Springs. And what was crazy about that is, and this is his sketch of the River Arts District. Here the river is gaining more and more inputs. It's getting cumulatively larger, bigger, and faster, and it has to be throated back down to get through the Asheville area because the city's up on the hill, but the RAD is hanging down on a low flood bench. And their drawing for Marshall was even more just breathtaking because Marshall is so steep and deep. And think about when you visit, you drive the switchbacks down and down and down to the French Broad. And humans throughout the region have always lived in proximity to water, but this made me appreciate the great vulnerability in a massive flood because this system is being asked to come back down and run through narrow areas, and it only has the option of scouring up high and going fast. One other aspect from this video that just astounded me, and I've known this, but until I really started looking at the maps. So we have the French Broad River watershed, which is the full-size watershed, and anything within that drains into streams and tributaries that ultimately end up in the French Broad. But take just the Swannanoa watershed. So Swannanoa River, I live in Black Mountain. It is a tiny, docile little river 95% of the time. And it's very misleading the size of watershed it serves. And so when these guys were showing this in their video, the Swannanoa watershed is large and it's very steep and it's very deep. So if you get epic rains like we experienced, they rained the heaviest up on those high peaks. And once saturation was overcome and the forests and the forest floors couldn't hold it anymore, they just had to let it all come down. And the thing that I will not get over from that event was, so I live in Black Mountain. This is just below my house. This is my photo. Right when the storm abated, my husband and I walked down, and the Swannanoa is normally like 5 or 8 feet across here in the bridge to old US 70. And the river was running a couple football fields across. And I looked at Dwayne and I was like, this is its headwaters. How can it look like this where it originates? Because it has to travel 18 miles and get into the French Broad and go through the RAD and out. And so I think understanding the size, power, and magnitude of our watersheds in huge rain events, which brings us to this other challenge. Our oceans are warming. One of the big factors in Helene's intensity was the incredible high water temps that were in the Gulf of Mexico. But the challenge is sea surface temperatures have been rising across the globe for 3 decades. And like 2024 saw the highest records. So much like that just happened in Valencia, coming off of really warm Mediterranean waters, we're faced with this new dilemma. Hurricanes are going to gain way more moisture and energy. They're going to get to be monsters, and they can move much further north than they ever could before. And I think this paragraph from NC Extension just said it best. It was close to a worst case scenario for Western North Carolina as seemingly limitless tropical moisture enhanced by interactions with the high terrain yielded some of the highest rainfall totals, followed by some of the highest river levels and some of the most severe flooding ever observed across the region. Then factor in, we're not alone. Flooding has become an enormous problem here in the States and around the globe. So just look in the last 24 years, how many flood disasters we've had in the United States alone and how they're just exponentially increasing. And this was from an op-ed that was written in the Washington Post after Helene. The United States, we have a flooding problem. And I'm going to touch on these topics a little bit later, but really there's only a handful of things we can do when you live in a flood-prone area. You can fight the water, but this is futile because when you live in a changing climate, this approach means ever more epic and expensive fortifications. And I would go on a limb and say very few retain holdback fortifications could have survived Helene in the Swannanoa or the French Broad. We can learn to live with it. And this is more where I lean. We've got to accept water will get in and design to get wet and or reduce what's in harm's way. Or you can do the pack your bag intentional retreat. And this is more practical in a coastal setting where areas have just decided that island or that bay would be better off giving it back to the ocean and flat up picking people up and moving them to other areas. Not very practical for our region. Now, throughout all of this, maybe one of the other really disconcerting side notes is here in the States, flood insurance rates are just going to continue to soar, and they're already really cost prohibitive. And I think given the uniqueness of this event, I feel like I saw a stat that only 1% of people in Buncombe County even had flood insurance. But even those that are in the floodplain going forward, after you're in an area that has had risk like we have, it's just going to be cost prohibitive. So if there's a silver lining in all of this, when you have a natural disaster of this size and it gets declared a federal emergency, the magnitude of resources and funding available is extraordinary. We've got towns and municipalities and counties hiring recovery specialist teams. Communities are assigned dedicated FEMA personnel. North Carolina, we've got this Rebuild North Carolina program because the eastern part of the state has had so much flood damage, and they're looking at helping do a planning feasibility study here for Western North Carolina. We have such an extraordinary council of government, our COG, Land of Sky. These guys are so resourced and connected. There is so much FEMA funding in this moment, and it comes in all these different formats. It comes in public assistance, which lets you a community build back. It comes in hazard mitigation, which lets you build back better. It comes in BRIC, which is building resilient infrastructure and communities in a 3-year landscape. There are state funding across all standard agencies. You have lobbyist groups out there getting more funding in the state budgets, and you have unprecedented foundation and private funding in this moment. So the good news is, if you're going to live through a natural disaster, we're really well resourced to get there. It's complicated. It's putting a puzzle together. This is a place where I always have more questions than answers, but learning every day as every community journeys forward. So there's been prior studies, right? This isn't new to us. There's been really good work that's been done, and some of it goes way back. This was shared with me recently. The Tennessee Valley Authority had this 128-page report assessing the historic and current and future flood risk on the French Broad and Swannanoa rivers. And so this thing, if you read it today, ahead of all the online AI and technology we have, it was so smart and profound. And the city and county both have done really good work. In 2018, City of Asheville worked with the National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center here, and they put out this really comprehensive climate resilience report. And they looked at 3 different categories of hazards. They looked extensively at flooding, and unfortunately, in these recent circumstances, the landslides became another huge hazard, and then wildfire, because we can also be drought and hot. So this study was really thorough. It explored climate threats and community assets. It looked at potential impact, vulnerability, and risk assessment. It addressed options to build resilience, and it prioritized actions. One thing that was taken out of this study that really caught my eye was in the flood section, just to remind us. So the top one is the French Broad, the bottom one is the Swannanoa, and it's just showing like, hey, at what point should you take action? At what point is flood stage? At what point is moderate flood stage? And at what point is major flood? But it really gives you a sense, over the past 100 years, both those rivers are prone to flooding. And I think we have to remember, every time something happens, like good new things happen, right? I mean, in this response to 2004 and in this study, the city responded by reducing exposure through voluntary property buyouts and flood control measures. But the problem is, we're in a flood-prone area, and we continue to increase the risk of flooding because we live in a very popular place with more development, and we keep introducing more impervious surfaces on the ones we already have. Another really good report that was done in partnership with Buncombe County in 2007. This was a flood damage reduction task force. This looked at a regional approach and a long-range plan for flood damage reduction and floodplain protection and watershed management. And so their goal was to plan and implement physical measures to reduce flooding. Now this study has a little bit more of an engineering hand on it, but they were like, we need to figure out how to keep it out. How do we incentivize? How do we do better stormwater management? We need to slow it down. This is one of Riverlink's mantra. We're usually talking green infrastructure. In this case, they were talking more engineering, like how do you physically retain it, reservoir it, impound it, channel it, convey it? And this get out of the way, right? Like, we've got to get our stuff out of the way and be really mindful of what we put in the way. This also spoke to the importance of education and outreach and emergency response, which I think is really something that's now brought to our attention after Helene. And just for a quick definition, this was included in that study. The 100-year floodplain is a human definition. FEMA uses it, and basically at its outer perimeters, each year you have a 1 in 100 chance of flooding. And obviously, as you get closer into the actual floodway, that increases. Now, for better or worse, this definition at least tries to make things tangible. With a changing climate, there are arguments and they're redoing maps to expand it, but this is sort of the premise of the vocabulary. So this flood reduction task force looked at, okay, in the floodway, in the more narrower space, proposing no new structures, proposing don't constrict the channel with bridges and sewer lines and buildings, look at purchasing key properties in the floodway and better upkeep of the floodway. And this one now, when we look at the Swannanoa in particular and see the amount of debris, both human and natural, like we are so vulnerable right now to more flooding if we cannot get that cleaned up. And then in the full system, they talked about this no net fill and looking at doing minimum buffers from the top of the bank, and whether you're on the main stem of the French Broad or the Swannanoa or even on the tributaries. They talked about closing the 50% improvement rule. This has to do with if you experience more than 50% of your structures value in flood damage, you need to build back to higher code. And there was questions about which valuation you use. And then they talked about cooperating regionally. And this one feels so important to me. So great studies have been done. But the challenge is these things are thoughtful, intelligent, comprehensive, resourceful, and some measures have been implemented. But recommendations are vast and extensive, and adopting any or all is just inherently challenging. It's long-term, it's political, it's expensive. Like just even thinking about the River Arts District example. When it was built out, it made sense at that time. There were all those old buildings, and to revitalize them for this purpose, and to end up with this gorgeous, amazing community of hundreds of artists. But in this moment, we've got to think about all the different competing pressures when we build back the River Arts District. You have these artists, and it's such a vital part of who we are, both for locals and for our guests. And then we have this really vulnerable floodplain down there. And how are we building back? And are we building back for everybody? And how do we acknowledge that we're going to flood again? So I have so much appreciation because RiverLink lives at the heart of the environment and the economy, but it's complicated. And then in and amongst all these solutions, we have to honor property rights, capitalism, human nature, and not forget all the other existing pressures and needs on our cities, towns, and communities on a good day when they're not at the center of a natural disaster. So much empathy and appreciation for how complicated this can be. But I'm also wondering, can we maybe just find some tangible resilient steps to recovery, recognizing, City of Asheville, Buncombe County, and all the other communities and municipalities, they have a toolkit, right? They can utilize zoning and permitting, and we've got this FEMA funding and other mechanisms. And this is a huge part of the solution, without a doubt, but it's also complicated and multifaceted. So I'm wondering if, in addition to all of that, can we just throw out some tangible ideas and solutions that would increase resilience as we move forward? These are not the end all. These are just ideas that we have over at RiverLink, and they're conversation starters. And so something that's hugely on my mind is there a tangible goal we could pick? Much like Buncombe County, I believe they hope to conserve 20% of Buncombe County by 2030. There's something so tangible and beautiful about that. Would it be possible to put a community-wide goal or a watershed-wide goal that we hope to gain 15% or more resiliency in our comeback? And there's a whole lot of different ways we can do it. Let's use RiverLink's example. Our offices were in the River Arts District. Our building, even though it's 3 steps off the ground, had 4 feet of water churning through it, and everything we own was totaled. So as RiverLink returns, we are going to return so much more resilient. We were carrying 35 years of history and stuff. We're going to come back lean, mean, portable. We're going to learn and go, I'm willing to bet RiverLink and our office can come back 60% more resilient. Can we take that idea and can we move it across other areas? For example, this one is so personally on Riverlink's mind. Could we secure and create more open and green space in the RAD and in that whole flood prone corridor as you head north? Because this is kind of where Riverlink's foundings were, right? Acquiring some of those early properties. That same idea is so intriguing to me. So as we build back the RAD, and whether it's through voluntary FEMA buyouts, whether it's through developers and realtors coming together with the city or with environmental organizations, or whether it's Riverlink trying to buy a property, much like we have in our current passive parks, can we please figure out a way to come back with more resilience? And what that also does is hugely protect the investments that are there. And can we think about doing that really passive and low maintenance? Because we understand how much is on our parks and recs, both at Buncombe County, City of Asheville. They have so much to take care of. And so if we're going to introduce more open space, can we do it in a way that uses nature? Can we use swales? Can we use mowable grass? Can we figure out ways to weave these in without adding to the maintenance portfolio burden of the entities that have to care for them? Could we consider rebuilding our river parks back with less infrastructure? This one's hard, but when we really think about it, so several beloved river parks, Carrier, French Broad River Park, Charles Owen up here in Swannanoa, these parks experienced extreme damage and destruction. And love all those amenities in those. But when we think about rebuilding them, maybe we need to rebuild them, but to be more of natural supporting elements with more passive use. Yes to greenways, yes to things that made it and survived. One thing that's been really interesting to see is we own Karen Craig Nolan Park, and this property just has some things going for it that fared well. It's built on fill, so it's high. And I've been talking to our engineering friends who have adopted us at Wildlands Engineering while we're displaced until the first of the year. You know, maybe the scour pattern was different. It still had like 15 feet of water on it, but we didn't have any scouring. And KCP has a wild and woolly riparian zone. It's multi-storied. You've got everything in there. You've got big trees, medium trees, shrubbery, grasses. You've got invasives, you've got natives, but we didn't lose any riverbank, and we actually don't have any view sheds of the river. And then just given the nature of the delineation of the property, we had to build it to go with the flow. So our greenway, our fence, all our elaborate signage is all linear to the river. And fortunately, all of it came through just unscathed. We only had a tree down at the carrier boundary fall on our fence. But there's got to be something learned there. Could the river parks be viewed more as amenities to the river, like they could be and should be just in nature's setting? And then riparian zones. Any river in the Southeast, left to its own devices, would have a very healthy riparian zone. It's its buffer, it's its filter. It helps tremendously with water quality, but more than anything, it prevents erosion. And so over the decades, the centuries of people, whether it's the early days in the railroad and logging or development, but we've lost a lot of our riparian zones. And so unfortunately, much of the French Broad River through the Asheville corridor actually looks like this drawing on the right. And what happens is, in a massive flood event like this, the lack of stability on the bank causes more and more erosion. And I don't know, now that I'm working on the West Asheville on the west side, and I go down to the Greenway, and on the west side, there's quite a healthy riparian zone and not much damage. But when you look across the river at the east side, because there wasn't a riparian zone just due to hundreds of years of activity, I would say as many of the big trees that were there before have now fallen over in their root balls, and the ones that remain are so vulnerable. So I think thinking about riparian zones differently, I'm even wondering now with Karen Craig Nolan Park, should we challenge ourselves? We have a native meadow there. Should we allow succession? Should we allow some trees to grow? Because I think that's the direction forward, is we have to put these elements back in. I would also ask us to just talk about or consider, can future greenways really think about their proximity to rivers and streams? Because as enjoyable as it is for people to have view sheds the whole time, it does come at the expense of the riparian zone. And I know it takes more in acquisition and more right of way, but I would ask that we consider if they could be set back further and we could leave more riparian zone intact, then we would have this front line of defense. Unfortunately, down in the RAD, that same section I was talking about, the erosion, bank erosion has gone so far back, part of the greenway is now falling in the river. And can we learn from what survived by asking why? It's amazing. Some of the old buildings that were built in the late 1800s survived both 1916 and 2024 without any damage. And a lot of features did well, like thinking about Carrier Park or Veterans Park in Black Mountain. So Carrier's Park Velodrome looks perfectly intact. I'm just a layperson, so I don't know if it's structurally sound. But that's an amazing amenity and feature. And so is there a way that Carrier comes back celebrating that element, but maybe it doesn't need all the massive infrastructure that went with it historically when it was the racetrack? Like, can we come back with a lower footprint? I was thinking the same about Veterans Park in Black Mountain. It's right on the Swannanoa. It's tons of ball fields, and they normally don't flood. And it's only all the fencing and all the elaborate infrastructure that collapsed, but like the ball fields did great. So can we think about that? What did well, and can we come back that way? This one's for Renee. Less is more. I know how broken Renee's heart is. Every day she thinks of this watershed and now what is in it. Our human inventions are everywhere in the watershed on the heels of this flood. It's almost too much to comprehend. And if we just built less in the floodway and if we had less things in the floodway when we know we're going to have a big flood, can we figure that out better? Can we get the U-Haul trucks out of the Swannanoa corridor before the flood? Like, how do we think about that? And how do we advocate for ecological restoration to be a priority? So there are so many things in line that need to happen. Like, we're kind of in the front end of debris pickup and removal, and that feels like that could go on for so long. But at the end of this, we have to figure out how to restore all these banks that have been incredibly damaged. And this would be my last kind of favor before I shift to what does it mean to be in a water-rich environment and then bring us home. Can we use this moment to have all of our fabulous community leaders, whether they be staff or elected, across all the jurisdictions? Could we come forward and share information in a way in response to this flood that we maybe don't do every day? Could we do it with the public? Could you do it amongst each other? Could we collaborate and work together? Could community members, please, like all of you guys that are out there, like start participating in planning and zoning and commission and council meetings as we recover, and start sharing your thoughts of what you hope to see as we build back. I know if given the opportunity to understand all the choices and decisions and next steps, we really could appreciate the complexity and the tough calls and ideas that have to be wrestled and the outcomes. And like, please, can we have the political will to advance resiliency? And can we try not to take the path of least resistance? And I would ask, can we invite your partners and stakeholders to the table? Can we hold public sessions to learn and for others to be heard? And I'm just going to use a Glennon Doyle thing here. This is hard, but I know we can do hard. And I think that's just my last favor on tangible outcomes is, can we come together in a way that maybe hasn't happened before? So last topic before I bring us home, we can't forget what it means to live in a water-rich environment. So the magnitude of this event, and hopefully it is statistically far and few between, but this event is requiring so much response and resources, but we can't let it completely define us, because we know we routinely have nuisance, medium, moderate, large-scale flooding all the time. And our resiliency efforts have to focus on these tertiary and secondary and primary waterways, because they're either part of the solution or they're part of the problem and will keep contributing to outcomes. We're flood prone. Yeah, we get the big floods, and they seem to come every 20-ish years. But in between, we have endless incidences of nuisance to medium flooding events that result in property and habitat damage. Like, I was reminded the other day that in January, after a 2-day rain event, the river parks were completely underwater. And it was just such an odd, it wasn't a named event. It was just, a couple days of rain. So I think just really recognizing we're flood prone. We live somewhere with a lot of rainfall. Just in an average year, Asheville's going to get 45 inches and Brevard 67 plus down there. And I think the concern for many is we're going to be even more vulnerable to future rains post Helene, because right now we've got blown out stream banks everywhere. We've got new drainage patterns running right into people's yards and houses. If we thought stormwater was problematic before, it is just going to create ongoing havoc. We have new runoff from mountain sources. We've got turbidity in places, the water supply. Like, there is so much of a new network going on. And we had a huge sediment problem before, and now we have raw sediment everywhere. There's going to be so much more sediment generation, and there's going to be ongoing activation of landslides and splintering. And so it's really a vulnerable time. So Riverlink spent the past year, coincidentally, on a reduce rain runoff campaign, because we know that human infrastructure introduces so many impervious surfaces. And the same mantra that applied before Helene applies after. We've got to figure out how to slow down our water, keep it on site, and let it return naturally. And it's critical that we figure this out at an individual level, at a neighborhood level, at a community level, because collectively, if we all come together, we can make a huge impact. And this is what Renee shared last time we were with you guys. There's so many easy mechanisms to do this, whether we're disconnecting downspouts and redirecting them, whether we're utilizing rain barrels, creating rain gardens, all these tools are at our disposal. And now we're thinking a lot about our streams, right? We're like, we're going to reactivate our Adopt a Stream program because we think it's super important that we reinforce and restore damaged stream banks at the local level. We're going to do workshops. We're going to do live staking. We must strengthen our resilience throughout the system, because the great irony is everything behind us is actually the front lines of our defense against flooding. And for Riverlink, this is what we did all day long before Helene. This is what we're going to be doing after Helene. You know, we just believe this is all so important, whether we're talking stormwater management and green infrastructure. We conserve land along urban and semi-urban streams. We build passive parks. We educate over 5,000 kiddos a year in this space for no charge. And we do all of this with a huge emphasis on equity. So here we are to the end. Let me just bring some large scale takeaways. I think individually and as communities, we really have to understand our risk tolerance for loss of life, homes, businesses, and just our overall economic and habitat destruction. And we have to remember how inequitable those choices are for many, right? Like, nothing like a natural disaster to make the vulnerable even more vulnerable. And we've got to recognize the simple fact of our geography and these bigger, wetter storms that are going to dictate our future. I don't think we can engineer our way out of this. I think we have to learn to live in and amongst the floodwater by smartly taking some of those recommendations, by putting less in those places. And I think we need tangible, measurable, resilient gains that nature-based, but we need to see that we made progress. And we've got to look at the human-induced impact. We have too much stuff in the floodplains. I don't think in good faith we can keep doing this to our environment. We're supposed to be the stewards of this place. This was a really good takeaway from the Asheville Climate Resilience Report. We have choices for building actionable resiliency. We can reduce exposure. We can remove assets from harm's way. We can become more adaptive. We can figure out how to make assets' ability to cope with the impacts or get wet. And we can support response and recovery. And I think we're getting 5 stars there right now from a national, state, local, community, neighborhood level. The recovery, people have called it a hurricane of humanity. It is maybe the best of us in this moment. And this is another really important fact. When you do a cost-benefit analysis, for every dollar we spend today to mitigate a future hazard, we're going to have $6 in benefit. And we cannot let Helene become the sole focus. We got to do this response and recovery, but we have to think about this beyond that. Prior to this event, we already had many rivers and streams here that had Department of Environmental Quality impairments for fecal coliform that were mostly brought on by sediment. So I would argue we must also simultaneously invest in creating resilience by reducing the human impact of runoff. So I will close with, I really believe the responsibility is fully ours to learn how to dance with this watershed, an extraordinary economic, recreational, and environmental treasure, as our lives and livelihoods truly depend on it. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you so much. So we've got some questions, but before we start with the questions, I just wanted to recognize Amanda Edwards and Jennifer Harton from Buncombe County Commission that are on the program or listening in tonight, and Ken Kahn, City Council at from Woodfin, and Kim Rooney, Asheville City Council. And hope I didn't miss any other elected officials. But let me start with a question or two here. First question is, would using more native plants in strategic areas rather than grass help?
Renee, are you out there? I'm going to have Renee tag team with me because she is our water resources manager, and her expertise on plants and stream bank restoration is extensive.
Yeah, I think that question was regarding your comment about building green infrastructure that has less maintenance requirements. Hence the grassed swale in that photo, because it just has to be mowed periodically. But certainly native plants are part of the solution as well, especially along our stream banks. I saw some questions about native river cane and how it fared during these storm events. I have several photos I've taken of native river cane down in the River Arts District on the French Broad, on the Swananoa River near Azalea Park. And both of those stands of river cane had 20 plus feet of water on top of them during the flood event. And they look like nothing happened. I mean, they look perfect. And around the river cane are large trees that have just toppled over. So yes to more river cane. It has proven to be very resilient to flooding. And we know that river cane has an extensive root system that does a great job at stabilizing stream banks as well.
Hey, a little bit more along that line from Sam. There's some early mention of management of flooding, including reservoirs, for example, but do we have any real options for managing where flood and other waters go?
I mean, I am not an engineer, but I think when you talk about floods of this type of event, no. And introducing, like, that's a whole nother topic, is a whole bunch of historic dams throughout the entire storm system across hundreds of miles were damaged, and many of them don't even serve a purpose anymore. And so I think humans' legacy of trying to contain, restrain, refrain, hold, fight back rarely ends up in the long haul working. I'm sure an engineering component would be helpful, but I think when you look at like the Swananoa and her ability to go pre-Helene, she was running at 1.5 feet at a gauge. At the peak event, I think she was at 26 or 27 feet. It's just not realistic in these tight corridors to imagine holding back something like that.
Lisa, I would add too, I think that was one of the big takeaways from that 2007 flood reduction task force study that the city and the county partnered on, was that they looked at a lot of engineered solutions along the Swananoa River to see if they could reduce the base flood elevation down in Biltmore Village, and none of those projects proved to be
like these,
feasible.
yeah, elaborate solutions, right? And what was the maximum gain? Like a 1/2 foot reduction or a foot reduction? It was something really modest, I think. But great question, fair question, expensive question.
Ken Kahn had a comment. He just said the river cane planting and all the Olivet community that was put in last December, I think with Riverlink's help there, not only survived, but the stream banks along it survived as well. So a good beta test for what river cane can do. Yeah. This stuff is some Ernie. He says Riverlink embarked on a multi-year plan in 2024 to improve the French Broad water quality and keeping stormwater runoff on each property when it was generated. And excuse me, I gotta scroll down here. How will this plan be abandoned, or is it more important than ever?
Well, I say the latter. And I think Renee, you can speak to it because it's your baby. But I think we're as committed, and that's kind of what I was sharing. And this is like, we've got to figure out a way to reduce our runoff for all the other times that we live between these massive, massive events like this.
And I think one of the questions that came up was, can we supersede the grandfathering of zoning? That many of these things that are there in the floodplain were zoned and built when it was okay to do that. And I don't know that you guys can answer that or not, but is there a way that that can be superseded? Are we stuck with that grandfathering by law?
I wouldn't want to represent that because I'm not informed enough. If a certain amount of damage happens, 50% or more to a building in the floodplain, my understanding is on its build back, it is held to that new standard. But in terms of grandfathering existing buildings, yeah, that's a city. And if we're talking the River Arts District, that's a city question.
Okay. It says another comment from Amy. Our community is deeply environmentally minded. We can set an example to other communities on how to rebuild our communities to adapt to climate change. So again, a challenge to us in saying that, you know, a lot of people in this community are willing to support the changes we need to make. So that was a comment. Another question: has FEMA or any entity already relaxed floodplain limitations activity to enhance the debris recovery, or any changes, sculpturing, etc.? Couldn't this actually cause future problems in the next flood if we scoop out sections of land when we're taking the removal out?
Renee, do you understand the question, or do you have a thought on that?
Maybe. I do know that the Army Corps of Engineers has relaxed some of the permitting requirements, and this is common after a disaster, so that property owners can, do things like scoop out excessive sediment buildup and do some repair to get things back to the way they were before. So, I mean, I think even despite the relaxing of some of the permitting requirements, it's still highly recommended that you contact the Army Corps of Engineers and kind of run it by them first, because they're also really good at providing instructions on how to do these activities while minimizing the impact to the waterway. But I do know that, entities like NCDOT, there's heavy equipment in our rivers now that is scooping material out and being used to rebuild roads that were washed away. And that certainly will impact the ecology of the river. And I'm not sure what the recovery time is going to be like on that, but it certainly will have impacts to aquatic life in the river.
Okay. A comment says basically, knowing that most of the issue arrives from upstream and continues downstream to others, we need a regional approach that is an ongoing effort, regionally adopted goals and actions. And Lisa, I think you talked about that a little bit in some of your presentation. Do you have further comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, can you hear me? Because I muted myself and then unmuted myself.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's so important because it's got to be comprehensive, right? The watershed doesn't know jurisdictional boundaries and everything goes downstream. And I think of, there's been some incidences in this where stuff was carried counties downstream. So my hope is we come together comprehensively, at least in the Swannanoa, French Broad River, main stem area, and work collaboratively, because it is going to take a comprehensive collaborative solution, right? Individual segments can't solve what's going, to your point, going downstream.
And somebody, you mentioned how vulnerable Marshall is because of how steep it is that, it's certainly in a constricted valley. How can it rebuild to be less flood prone in the future? Or is it just?
I think it has to build back with adaptability, right? Because humans forever, and especially in this type of topography, it reminds me of like a vascular system, right? People are living on capillaries and veins and arteries, and And I think you do it with the knowledge, and I think you build back with the adaptability that if and when you flood, you can minimize the risk to yourself and life and livelihood. And you've built in a way that acknowledges flooding, right? Live with it, learn how to live with the water.
Okay. Heather has a question. It says, so what is the general consensus on the environmental damage from Silverline and Republic waste storage that were along the river that flooded so badly?
Are we talking in terms of water quality or pipes?
Yes, I think it's water quality.
Because the pipes, I would say at this point. Renee, do you want to speak to that a little bit? Mountain True did an extraordinary job of sampling, and I believe they came up with pretty modest impact from a water quality perspective. Is that a fair statement, do you think, Renee?
Yeah, I think we're still trying to gain a full, like a complete picture, you know, a better understanding of what water quality is like in the waterways post Helene. And it's going to take some time, but yeah, the French Broad Riverkeeper, their team has been out collecting water samples along the French Broad and the Swannanoa and some of the tributary streams. They've collected sediment samples at Silverline, IPEX, as well as downstream in Marshall, because there were reports of people, you know, being negatively impacted by the floodwaters in Marshall, and it was believed that maybe it was coming from, you know, the Silverline factory being flooded. But their preliminary results from those tests did not show shocking amounts of contaminants in the sediments. There was evidence of some contaminants related to petrochemicals, but even those were at levels that were not considered harmful to humans. They were still relatively low. So I think the news is probably better than we initially thought in terms of water quality.
Great, thank you. This is a comment from Tom. In geographic terms, these floods have been quite frequent because erosion from our mountains actually created the Piedmont and certainly the entire coastal plain of North Carolina. I really liked your emphasis on living in a water-rich environment. So, comment there. A lot of just great thank yous and excellent discussion, background presentation, suggestions on path forwards. Thank you so much for doing this. What role did invasive plants play in the flood destruction, and can the city or county do more to control invasives along the floodplain?
Renee and I might tango over this because I'm not educated in this space, but I'm such a fan of a robust riparian zone that if you have a few invasives in the mix versus trying to really deal with invasives, but in a perfect world, obviously, Renee, your answer to speaking to the role of how important native is versus invasive.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we know that native plants have deeper, more extensive root systems, and they do a much better job at stabilizing stream banks and keeping them from eroding. But to Lisa's point, I do know there are areas of stream bank where it's nothing but invasives, and I would say that that's better than the alternative of not having any vegetation on our stream banks.
Okay. This is a question or maybe a suggestion, but has any previous effort been made to identify small and large toxic chemical locations such as auto shops and golf courses and work to help small businesses minimize the risk of chemicals entering the floodwaters in the future?
That is a great question. I personally don't, in my young time with Riverlink, don't know of that. Renee, do you?
I know that NCDEQ tracks things like below ground storage tanks, you know, old dry cleaning businesses and contamination from those, certainly brownfield sites. And that data is publicly available, but probably not to the level of detail that you're speaking to. We have done watershed restoration plans, particularly for the Central Asheville watershed. And through that process, we did document things like garages, junk cars, areas of potential contamination. So that is something that is done by groups when they do watershed planning.
Okay. Again, so many people talking about what a great presentation you guys have done, and thank you. But I want to read at least one other one here. Yay, Mom, that was fantastic.
That's my
That was-
daughter in San Diego. Yeah, thanks, Belle.
And your other daughter was on as well, and also had a
Oh
comment.
yeah, my Portland, Maine daughter. Great. I
Yep.
love it.
So you have your own fan club from around the country.
It
Cheers you on here.
feels good. Yeah.
Good. Again, so many people saying thank you for a fantastic presentation. So I'm going to turn it back over to Judy, unless you, Lisa, you and Renee have any closing comments you want to make before I turn it back to Judy?
Well, I want to thank both of you. It was exceptional. As you see in the chat, everyone's saying, wow, that was great. I do want to say that Lisa's offered to give us links to some of her report, that this is a recorded session. Please look at our website and we will add the links from Lisa over the next few days. Give us a couple of days. And you can go back and look at some of these reports in depth if you want to follow the link. I do want to invite everyone to come back December 11th, the second Wednesday, for our potluck holiday celebration at the Unitarian Church, 1 Edwin Place. And we'll be in person and we can hug everybody and we can cheer of all the local election celebrations and the state election celebrations. So Lisa, thank you. Renee, thank you. It was exceptional. See you in a month, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.